Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Theta, and this is the Summer 2021 Preview Show. This is our 9th preview show, as we've been doing this for 2 years now. I can hardly believe it. I have picked 18 shows to talk about today, which is a little more reasonable compared to what we did in the spring. If you haven't been here before, here is the deal. I'll be making some spoiler-lite comments about the first episode of each show, as well as showing selected clips that are intended to give you a sense of the style, but without giving too much away. These are what I call premise spoilers, as the purpose of this stream is to give people a short impression of what each show may be like. And that means genre, tone, initial setup, interesting hooks, that sort of thing. Yeah, and as chat is indicating, yes, there are a lot of isekais today. We won't actually talk about all of them. Some are sequels, and this show only ever covers new series. Let's see. I do not want to ruin the experience of watching these premieres for yourself, so I'm trying to split the difference between sharing enough to keep you informed and holding back enough to help preserve the novelty. You will see then that the spoiler banner forbids all spoilers. I asked the audience not to make any comments about the content of these shows. However, you are free to share your impressions, likes or dislikes about the premieres or directions or the characters, whether or not you liked the credit sequence. Just things that won't give away the substance of these episodes. I know some of you have seen most or even all of them already, but I try to make this show suitable even if you haven't gotten a chance to check out any of the new season. At the end, then we can chat about any questions you have, anything I skipped over. We have a lot we need to get through first. There's a lot we need to... Oh my god! What? What? What happened? What? There was the truck, and what am I wearing? Hat? Am I an elf? Oh, phew. There was the truck, and I've been summoned to another world. But I'm still on my stage. And I don't feel any different. And this thing's made out of cardboard. Well, everybody, welcome to today's broadcast. I've been summoned to another world, but I still have to do the preview show. There are indeed quite a few isekais today, and I thought, how better to get in the spirit. Much like the people we will be talking about today, it doesn't always go the way you want. You don't always quite get the things you hoped for. I'm glad you like that sub. Thank you for the resubscribes. I know there's a whole host of them right now, and the opening bit kind of covered things up. But thank you very much. Yes, it has been 2 years. We have been doing this. This is the 9th time. We have 18 shows to get through, but I thought it wise to put all of the isekai together at the front so that we can get this out of the way. Okay, they're not all that bad. But here is our lineup for today. As you can see, roughly this order. So, let's just get right to it. After the stream is done today, by the way, we'll open up the seasonal watch list voting for the next week. That is how we will determine which shows in Discord get to their own channels. Hey, I said it right that time. and which ones have to languish in the general chat and be subjected to spoilers. We'll also be trying to figure out what will take the place of Shadow's House and Odd Taxi, which are the ones we watched live week to week this past season. I think there are some contenders this time. Maybe not right at the start of the list. So, we will begin with Tsukimichi, Moonlit Fantasy. Alright, so I thought I'd start the roundup of isekai stories with the one that is basically, having the most fun with the idea. This follows a standard summoning of a hero to another world script. Standard script in which the main character, Mikoto, he is actually quite familiar with that. And then he is thus very quick to realize when things go horribly, terribly wrong. The goddess who summons him isn't thrilled with how ugly he is. Her world may be in danger, but a goddess has to have standards when it comes to heroes, you know? He thus starts out with something of a paltry boon and gets sent to as remote a land as she can think of. But it doesn't mean he's helpless. Tsukuyomi, the moon god in Shinto mythology, he serves as something like an emissary representing Earth, and he explains to Mikoto that his parents are the actual isekai ones, and part of the deal is that one day they'd have to give something back to the goddess as part of a contract. Well, that means him, but it also means he's not exactly from Earth. Rather, it has constrained and trained the power he would normally have, and so in this new world, he is quite powerful. Actually, way too powerful. Think less of an indomitable fantasy hero, and more of a toddler with a hand grenade. And of course, since he is genre savvy, he's aware of just how badly he is overdoing it at times. So what we seem to end up with is splitting the difference between two kinds of isekai tales. Rather than one where things go really well for the MC, or where they go really badly for him because it's overturning the usual formula, it instead goes well for him in the power fantasy sense, but poorly in the ensuing results. As you can probably tell from the character designs, this seems like it will be a comedy adventure rather than drama or tragedy. It isn't shy about violence either, as befits someone who doesn't quite know their own strength. The credit sequences tease some other possible elements down the line too, but I won't mention them here. The premiere successfully begins the story, set expectations for the whole thing, Clap, clap. So, this particular variant of isekai is well described by its title, How a Realist Hero Rebuilt the Kingdom. This is basically what would happen if you dropped a civil servant into a fantasy feudal crisis, and they tried to solve things with careful policy decisions rather than magical power-ups or fighting strength. If you grow tired of the isekai setup where people act in ways that fit a fantasy story, but not in ways that would make sense from a more grounded approach, then this might be up your alley. Of course, it is thus missing the razzle-dazzle that such a setup usually involves. I imagine some people watching this may even come away and think, you know what? Never mind about that whole thing about wanting more realism in my stories. The amusing part, of course, is that other people in the story, they are also expecting him to be more of a typical fantasy summoned hero, and thus prejudge his behaviors and moves accordingly. They aren't necessarily anticipating that he will try to save the day with the power of bureaucracy. Despite this particular twist, a lot of elements are played completely straight. His Earth life is neatly wrapped up in a bow as part of the setup, and the summoning of a hero through a magical ritual to save a nation in a time of desperation is given its due as the stock inciting incident. We get standard character tropes, like the hapless king, the plucky princess, wise queen, the trusted vizier, and what looks like a cast of feudal rivals just given a little fantasy race treatment. The hero also gets a power as part of the summoning, though not exactly a standard one. We even get the well-loved circular walled city. There's possibly even a setup for a cute romantic bit down the line. Now, despite these played straight elements, there is a bit of having fun with them in a kind of low-key way. The tone is relatively grounded overall, but there's some understated winking or joking hidden in some of the decisions that are made. What we can expect, I imagine, is a story showing off the wisdom of centuries worth of nation building on Earth, just applied to a fantasy world. The overall sober flavor of the thing kind of suits this approach pretty well, I think. But again, I'd expect it to be rather light on the spectacle. That may be either really appealing, or it may be really off-putting. It all kind of depends on your premises, on your preferences. The premise you're signing up for. Whatever. I slept poorly. Okay, that's 2 isekai down. Next up, we've got... Well, I'll just show you. When you are discussing isekai works, you invariably find yourself wanting to highlight what makes them different from one another, and you'll see me doing this basically for all of them today. You want to emphasize what makes them different from each other in the same way you might want to emphasize the unique setup for any particular rom-com or any slice of life. In Seirei Gensouki, what might be the most interesting hook is not actually in the premiere at all, but can be surmised from both credit sequences. That puts me in a bit of a bind for giving a spoiler-lite rundown. I'm bringing it up so you can either go see what I mean yourself by studying said sequences, or just be forewarned that the OP and ED are going to telegraph the direction of the story, just in case you want to avoid them. If you do avoid them, some of the setup of this premiere will not make any sense. It's not incomprehensible or anything, just some scenes whose inclusion will seem random in light of the story we actually see. Luckily, it is not the only thing that gives the show its own flavor. Besides a variation on the venerable hit by a truck incident, the choice of when exactly the isekai person comes in the new world gives us a possibility for a fresh way to unfold what is otherwise a very familiar pattern. Basically, a kid named Ryo has a bout of fever, awakens to memories of being a 20-year-old boy named Haruto who lived in Japan. Haruto was thus not reborn as an infant in a new world with memories intact, nor summoned there directly via ritual or death. Instead, Ryo has already had a life of just being Ryo before the Haruto part even wakes up. While this is not the only example of that kind of isekai, the notable thing, I think, is that the older original self does not seem to overwrite the pre-existing kid of Ryo. In fact, the series is like a classic fantasy setup before the isekai part comes in at all. You've got an orphaned kid living in the slums, he's intent on avenging his family, he gets drawn into a plot involving kidnapping in the royal family, the situation is complicated by differences in class, feudal hierarchy. It's a fantasy adventure played pretty straight from that point of view, even down to the orphaned kid having hidden potential that is discovered by fate, saving the day in a clutch moment. Thus, in one sense, it's like the isekai part is the thing making an adventure story unique, rather than the other way around. His previous life just seems to be the shape of the timely power-up that helps alter his destiny. Importantly, it doesn't seem like remembering 20 years of life in Japan changes his goals or changes his personality, which I dare say is quite different from the usual isekai standard, where the whole point is having someone similar to the audience make their way through an unfamiliar world. While, one episode is not enough to be certain, the possibilities of two versions of himself having different goals or levels of understanding gives this potential to tweak a comfortably familiar premise into something rather novel. There is certainly a load of recognizable character tropes and set pieces, but I feel like, without knowing further, I feel like there is the potential for the not yet explained elements to actually give us something rather fresh. All right, so next up. This one's ridiculous. Next up is The Dungeon of Black Company. So, once again, gotta come up with a variation on the isekai formula. There's many series that invert the power fantasy, having the newly summoned hero end up in a worse predicament, or at least one that runs counter to their expectations. In theory, this helps invoke audience sympathies. We're more likely to root for an underdog to overcome their circumstances than to, just watch somebody all-powerful display example after example of their superiority. The Dungeon of Black Company does go for the inversion tactic as well, but breaks from that secondary pattern in a key way, because our summoned main character is not sympathetic. The opening sets up his characterization rather quickly, where he is laughing with delight at all the working stiff suckers struggling through their commute while he looks down from on high. By his own words, he is an uber pro neat who didn't want to do any work, and so did his best to earn his money via investments, and then into rental properties, building up passive income so that he'd never have to work. This culminates in building himself a penthouse on top of an apartment building he owns, where he can lord his lofty view over the job commuters below. Of course, since he's disparaging members of the workforce as losers rather than just celebrating his own success, we end up being amused to see him get isekai'd out of his cushy life right in the middle of a mocking speech. The world he's been summoned into is essentially what would happen in a fantasy society if they actually progressed technologically. Eventually, adventurers going into dungeons to fight monsters and find treasure gives way to industrial-scale dungeon mining operations. With, of course, awful sweatshop-like working conditions. It's capitalism run amok, but in a fantasy world. Hence the title Dungeon of a Black Company. A black company is a Japanese term for an exploitative business. All of our uber pro neat success in our world, well, it counts for nothing here. And so now the shoe is on the other foot, and he is a lowly wage worker, wielding a pickaxe alongside downtrodden demi-humans. Of course, he is determined to climb back to the top where he no longer needs to work, and he has no scruples about how he goes about it. We join him after he's already gotten into massive debt and is doing backbreaking labor in order to repay, but he's unmotivated for that kind of work and schemes shortcuts back to the top, to the misfortune of everybody else. Now, there's two things the series is doing pretty well, I think. One is that by making the main character unsympathetic, the audience isn't just okay with the misfortune that comes his way, we're actually kind of glad when it happens. This lets it be a series of disasters without our tendency to feel sorry for a character getting in the way of just laughing at every new failing. The other is the through-the-looking-glass critique of exploitive company culture in our own world, including the mindsets of those who perpetuate it. You have both sympathetic and unsympathetic grunt workers, sniveling middle managers, clueless or sociopathic overseers, and instances of both hopelessness and get-rich-quick scheming among the working class. It just all gets a very fantasy twist, so we look at it with fresher eyes than we would use to judge our own world. But, suffice to say, it's just a bit ridiculous. Now, the last of our isekai roundup, maybe. As I mentioned in the opening, we do not talk about sequels, as that means no slime, no standing on a million lives, no Baccarina, more's the pity. So the last one we have to talk about is Drugstore in Another World, The Slow Life of a Cheat Pharmacist, which is that one. Alright, so a few of the other isekai in the roundup, they toyed a bit with the transition to the world part, sometimes pointing out the pattern, sometimes playing it straight, but with unexpected outcome, sometimes just defying it for humor. Drugstore in Another World decides to just skip that part of an isekai entirely. Like, other than a short narration describing our MC as a former corporate drone, and the part of the title that says, "In Another World," there is nothing about the setup that indicates it's not a simple fantasy slice of life about a gifted pharmacist. And, interestingly enough, it doesn't lose anything for the skip, instead beginning into the story a bit after he's already opened a shop and met some folks who will work alongside him. You don't really need the preamble to understand what happens in the episode, unless this is like your first year watching anime, though I won't be surprised if we get snippets of the past later on. Right from the beginning, though, the lighter tone is going to be obvious, introducing us to the titular pharmacist and his were-puppy mascot, and the resident ghost. Totally normal lineup. Character designs will support the light, low-stakes tone of the work, complete with little fairies that fly in to hold physical wooden signs for labeling the characters, even when completely unnecessary. It's simple, but not unsuitable. This episode is structured as a series of vignettes, and I presume all episodes will be similar. This further gives it the feel of a slice of life rather than an isekai adventure, though with comedic notes throughout, such as, well, the very wacky townspeople. This impression is helped along if you recognize our main character's voice as belonging to Kazuma of Konosuba. Not just the same voice actor, but the actual Kazuma voice. As you may surmise, the show isn't taking itself too seriously, and I think anyone who tries to do so will be left disappointed. The whole setup so far is just that he's a gifted pharmacist. His potions don't just work, they're downright delicious. This is a shocking development, apparently, and so word spreads. It sets him up to be something of a problem solver for others via pharmaceutical magic, with the help of his other shop workers. That said, there seems to be quite a bit more cast to come, so the whole thing could look very different in short order. While there is at least some depth to our main character, everyone else feels a bit one note out of the gate. Fine for the case of the week, but it will sorely need more complexity in the recurring characters down the stretch. This is true even if it purely aims to be a comfortable little collection of minor crises that our otherworldly apothecary can overcome a couple times an episode. In fact, it's probably more important in a lighter narrative that the characters be nuanced and fleshed out. That strikes me as the thing that is lacking the most from the premiere, but it is something that they actually can address. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, so we'll just have to see, but definitely that weakness out of the gate, I would say. Next up on this list is Sonny Boy. Assuming that works. There we go. Alright, so this is certainly something. I've placed it after the isekai because, well, maybe it qualifies? Certainly at first, when it almost casually introduces that 36 students in their school suddenly found themselves in total blackness. Did they travel to another world? Did the whole rest of the world itself just disappear? Should be counted among our collection. At the end of the premiere, I can safely say that I have no idea. And in fairness, that is actually only the beginning of things that I have no idea about. In addition to the whole students in their school in some kind of trapped space or whatever, several of the students also manifested superpowers at the same time. Don't think for a second, though, that this is a setup to some kind of fantasy adventure or a superhero romp. Certainly, 36 isolated students and newfound powers make me first think, well, this is a setup for a battle royale. But as the episode unfolds, I also realize that this is not too far from the setup for Lord of the Flies. Now, I don't expect that description of the premise to be enough to grab your attention by itself. And as you can see from the clips, it is not among the most visually stunning of our works today. However, this more realistic style suits it well. And by realistic, I don't mean that it's trying to faithfully reproduce our world, but rather that many aesthetic elements are as unremarkable as their real-life counterparts. Things are discolored, rusted, drab, and they're simple enough to convey what they are without stealing any thunder from the human drama. The characters as well are realistically proportioned compared to the majority of anime, and, like the environment, mostly lack any ornamentation. All of this goes along well with a story that is likely to get a little messy and a little bit dirty. I don't think it's going to be a pretty little tale. It is also a tale that demands that you pay attention. A rewatch of the premiere itself may be advisable to try to make as much sense of it as you can, as we don't get the initial change between worlds, and there are almost no expository conversations to help us out. We are dropped in the middle of it after their initial surprise and adjustment must have already worn off, and we only have their few interactions to make sense of things. It's not even clear how many students have powers, and no one gives you a rundown of what they are or what they do, and a fair amount of them seem to act strangely normal. Now, of more interest to me perhaps, thematically, we seem to have some individualism versus conformity, we have security versus freedom subtext, and we will see some nascent attempts at self-governing. The pair of characters we seem to be following most closely are clear outsiders, while others are either trying to make order from chaos or challenging the normal idea of order. I'm trying really hard not to say too much about it, honestly, because the subtlety of how it unfolds its world and all the initial characterizations is a lot of the appeal, right? The writing is the star here. The skill of execution, though, is not easily communicated in summation or just with these random clips. And while their situation is clearly the starting mystery, it'll be clear over the course of the premiere that several students have mysteries all their own. Also, I have no idea what the title is invoking, so just add that to the pile of the unexplained. In short, don't miss this one. Next up, The Detective is Already Dead. The Detective is Already Dead is one of the double-length premieres in today's lineup. Even though there is a clear break where the first episode would normally give way to the second, the very end of that double premiere will make it obvious why they went for the extended runtime. Of course, since it's the very end of said episode, I'm not going to explain it here. I will say at least that the overall setup in the premiere isn't quite what you think, even if there are elements of the way it develops that do seem inevitable. I thus found myself in an odd situation by episode's end, left with a burning curiosity about the next episode, which I guess is a good thing to say about any premiere. This is one of the few premieres this time where I feel like I need to see what's next to even make any kind of informed commentary. But I didn't do that, so please accept my premiere-only perspective. The rough setup is that we have legendary detective Siesta and our point-of-view character that she nicknames Kimi, who she ropes into being her sidekick. Sort of. While she may be a legendary detective, he instead is a trouble magnet, and always has been, and thus has no interest in being involved with someone who can only make that condition worse. But of course, with such a condition, he should expect someone like Siesta and the related cases coming into his life. Now, despite the presence of recognizable detective story tropes, I wouldn't say the cases that we see in the opening really fit into the mystery genre. Their introductions and resolutions are more like normal story conflicts that are just given a detective fiction air. However, the overall story seems like it may have much more serious mysteries all its own. Out of the gate, however, it doesn't strike me as what you might expect when seeing the word detective in the title. The same perhaps goes for the titular detective herself. Siesta is a rather unique personality, without seeming like an exaggeration, and without quite nestling into existing character archetypes. While she seems to torment Kimi with her demands, and her actions, and her comments, it's really unclear whether these are chosen specifically because they torment him, or just a natural result of her character. And it even seems that she could be obfuscating the answer to that question on purpose, a subtle, probing habit that she never quite turns off, which befits a legendary detective. Kimi is the straight man by comparison, but he possesses a fair dose of patience and has rather understated reactions, well, at least by the standards of anime. Despite the speculative fiction elements and the character designs which do scream anime, the atypical elements keep it from seeming like a rerun of stories that you have seen before. Relatedly, the pacing is another thing that prevents this from slotting comfortably into mystery or detective fiction, as the rising and falling actions seems a lot more about the characterization than the conflict and resolution in the narrative. I think it perhaps even comes off disjointed, especially if that is your expectation of the kind of story it is. I might make a similar observation about the dialogue, which is why I would stop short of calling it tight exactly, but it's certainly not recycled, and it's certainly not obvious banter, so there's certainly appeal there. It overall consists mostly of very clean but simple animation, yet will occasionally dip into something fancier to match the intensity of the scene. Those moments also stand out as not quite what you expect from something that presents as a Case of the Week series. You can probably discern the pattern to my comments, and that is the uncertainty I have about this show. Not its merits, necessarily, but whether the gap between its expectations and its realities are indicative of something that matters to the soul of the piece, that is, they're being done on purpose, or they're just particular foibles of the writer or the director desiring to do something a little different. How different? I don't know. At least until I watch the next episode, which I freely confess I am just dying to do, and I can see in chat that I am not alone, so make of that what you will. Next up, Girlfriend. Like the isekai, I feel like a little bit of preamble is in order. Ecchi romantic comedy is how I would categorize it, and that category comes with certain expectations. The ecchi, of course, which I'll come back to, and the romantic comedy. Now, rom-coms in anime series frequently involve student-age characters having some kind of difficulty finding, or winning, or keeping the object of their affection. In order for the distance between setup and resolution to be long enough to justify a whole series, and keeping any kind of pairings delayed, a variety of techniques are often employed. One is making some of the characters clueless, unable to pick up on the signs that others are interested in them. Working hand in hand with cluelessness, another technique is afflicting characters with an inability to be honest. To the object of their affection, certainly, but often they are also unable to be honest themselves. With some of our cast unable to speak plainly, and others unable to pick up on hints, you end up treading water, often to the audience, who knows that this could all be tied up rather neatly if they just weren't afflicted with so many shortcomings. Or at least those particular shortcomings. So, what if you had a romantic comedy that defied some of that? What if it was really plain how everyone felt about everyone else? What if characters had no problems being honest? And I mean, no problem. Like way too much honesty going around. Well, what do you think that would look like? It's gonna look at least a little bit like girlfriend. Now, out of the gate, say the first 8 or 9 minutes, you might be really skeptical or even put off a bit. Our male MC is so unabashedly earnest and try-hard that he threatens to be a never-ending source of second-hand cringe. Likewise, the initial phase of setup doesn't seem all that novel, and could even have gone somewhere unpleasant, so I would understand if someone checked out before getting even halfway in. I understand that impulse, because it was how I was feeling as well. At least at first. So here's the setup. Our male character, Naoya, has finally won over his childhood friend, Saki, that he's crushed on for years, and he's living on cloud 9 thanks to this development. Surely nothing could complicate matters. Well, except for his own over-eagerness. But besides that, surely nothing could come between them. And then some cute first-year named Nagisa confesses to him. But he has a girlfriend, so that's not really an issue. He'll just let her down gently. But man, she really is cute. And she brought food. Oh, that's really sweet and all, but holy crap, she can cook! And she put so much work into this confession, and she's so earnest, just like Naoya. She's like a kindred spirit. Oh, but he could never let his Saki go after waiting so long to be together. There's really only one right choice and one wrong choice, right? Or there's some other choice that would certainly never occur to me, or probably not to any reasonable person. But that is the choice that he takes. Shenanigans ensue. I confess that once I understand that this was a show with ridiculous characters in a ridiculous situation, I let it do its thing, and I found myself pretty entertained. Naoya is ridiculous and you want to strangle him at times, but his shameless honesty is so unstereotypical that the audacity of it kind of carries him. Saki, the girlfriend, she is the one most aware of how ridiculous their situation is. She may actually be the closest thing to an audience surrogate in the story, at least through the premiere, while simultaneously being the one that a lot of the humor depends on, which is at least a little bit of a novel setup. And Nagisa is basically the perfect girlfriend candidate on paper, and she really wants to be with Naoya. And she seemingly has no scruples as to how she pursues this goal. Now, like I said, this is ecchi comedy, but I feel like it is, the right way to do it? What I mean is that it justifies the moments of titillation because of the setup and leans into it, rather than a romantic comedy that just decides to graft random fan service moments onto the whole. Usually, you will have a character point of view to explain why we're being given a lascivious framing, rather than left feeling like, well, the cameraman really needs to get laid. Likewise, being first-year students is justified beyond just being the target demographic, as the setup only works to the degree it does because we understand we are dealing with inexperienced characters. I will stop short of calling it plausible, but knowing that it's everyone's first time with this whole love thing makes all of the miscues and absurdities seem at least a little less out of place. Likewise, then, with the sexual situations. The overall scenario may be ridiculous, but the titillating circumstances that would arise from it actually make perfect sense. This, again, is where the unabashed honesty of the characters gives this a fresh turn, addressing believable thoughts and uncertainties rather than just blushing and avoiding. To the degree it can be, I feel like this was a justified ecchi comedy. So long as you can accept the setup, I feel like this one has the means to entertain. The real litmus test is actually yet to come, whenever the characters beyond those three will become a regular part of things, once we expand beyond our first three people. For now, though, frankly, this was actually one of the most entertaining premieres for me, personally. Next, which I've put next to it on purpose, if I can find it. Boy Riverside. So I put this after Girlfriend, because I feel like it has examples of unjustified ecchi elements. Like these situations, designs, and framing, they exist just to service the audience and have no attachment to the actual story. It's not even a romance or a romantic comedy. It's a fantasy adventure, so they're especially superlative and, I dare say, distracting. In case you wanted something to compare the earlier comments to. So, as to the actual story, it appears to be a retelling, kind of, maybe inspired by the folktale of Momotaro, hence the Peach Boy part of the title. I'll say that, if nothing else, I just love the very first frame of the episode. I feel like my very existence is being judged by her, and no explanation I can offer will be sufficient. This is the face everyone is making looking at my get-ups today, I imagine. Anyway, this is our main character, Sally, and the thing she is so confused by is some kind of rabbit person in a sailor suit. She offers her a carrot, a literal carrot, not an incentive, and somehow this kicks off the episode, though the overall story seems to involve Sally looking for someone from her past. Befitting a world loosely based on the Momotaro folktale, there are humans and Oni, and no love lost between them. There are also demi-humans like our rabbit friend, however, and humans' mistrust extends to them as well, and thus, our premiere has a little heavy-handed exploration of the old fantasy racism trope. The series so far is more tell, don't show than is probably advisable, and even beyond the fantasy racism setup, we have something of a conga line of well-worn fantasy patterns. I feel I should also give warning that it is a lot more violently graphic than the early tone would lead you to believe. The misadventure setup gives way to something a little higher stakes and a little more intense. It will remain to be seen if tone whiplash is a bug or a feature, but I'd guess on the more violent elements being common down the stretch, considering its inspiration. Ultimately, this strikes me as an interesting high concept for a story that is somewhat marred by its execution, and the unnecessary voyeurism when it comes to Sally. Though, I suppose I should at least commend the animators on their consistency in representing just how excruciatingly tight her pants must be. Once committed to the path of fanservice, I guess I cannot criticize any lack of dedication. And the first one on the new list is Remake Our Life. All right. So, the full title of this one is Remake Our Life. Let's time travel to 10 years ago and re-enjoy creative and sweet youthful days. While that sounds like it's giving away the whole premiere, take some comfort in the fact that it doesn't quite develop the way you may expect. The seed for the story, overall, is a common question that people ask themselves or others as they get further into adulthood. Was there a moment in your life when you had to choose between two paths? And do you wonder what would your life be like if you had chosen differently? Our main character is 28, and after doing normal, boring work for a few years after college, found himself wanting to join the creative industry, especially games. However, it is something of a fickle business, and he met with failure, and we first join him as he's using the last bit of his cash to take a bus back to his parents' house. In the past, it seems he had one of those watershed moments, where he had gotten into an art school, as well as a school with a more pragmatic course of study. He chose the safer bet, but of course it hasn't panned out the way he expected. Intensifying this regret is a trio of creatives known as the Platinum Generation, who are basically setting the world on fire with their efforts. Not only are they the same age as him, but they went to the very same school that he declined to attend. Had he chosen differently, he would have been their classmate. Maybe his own life trajectory would have looked more like theirs. If only he could go back and choose differently. Well, between that setup and the title, I don't think I need to share any more premise. This is also a double-length premiere, and it uses that extra time to try to give us a sense of the story going forward and some of the topics it will address. This is actually where it really gets my attention, as you're going to be spending time with a bunch of eager young college students in a visual arts program. Rather than just being a slice of life, but college edition, it appears it will concern itself with creative fields and the people who pursue them, and how they may fail or succeed, and why. There's a nice speech early on about the inessential nature of what they're choosing, and coupled with our main character's hopes and fears, I'm led to believe we'll have a focus on things like skill versus effort, experience versus talent, and so on, in addition to things like working with others and, coming of age type of story. It reminds me the most of a series called The Pet Girl of Sakura-so, though with an older cast and a much more grounded tone. One scene even seems lifted straight from it, but there is a lot of overlap in setup. There is creative types attending the same school and living together in a shared home, and so it has a mix of school-related narratives and domestic narratives. I suspect it will likewise concern itself with the concept of genius, the effect that being gifted has on those with the gift, and the effect it has on the people around them. At the very least, a lot of the same pieces are there. Now, you can unfortunately predict some things faster than the protagonist, and it remains to be seen if that is a long-term problem. However, it's mostly due to meta-reasoning that we can make some of the correct leaps, so this is not a case of a boneheaded MC. I will say that this premiere was not as end-to-end tight as a couple of the others, but for me at least, it seems to have a pretty solid foundation. Outside of the themes, I particularly like that there are lots of elements of story or art crafting that intrude into the story, but not in a fourth wall breaking kind of way. Rather, the in-universe creative discourse seems like it may occasionally mirror or even foreshadow the narrative. Likewise, there is rapid characterization of the main core of cast, which bodes well for the sense of pacing overall. I am definitely hopeful for this one overall. As long as we're on long titles that illuminate the shape of the whole story, Next up is The Aquatope on White Sand. The two girls met in the ruins of Damaged Dream. No, I don't know what an aquatope is either. My best guess is that they mean aquatrope, and that they are riffing off the idea of a heliotrope. The heliotropes are flowers that turn throughout the day to face the sun. If so, then I would guess that an aquatrope would be something that keeps its face to the water, or its face to the sea, or something. And as long as I am speculating on non-story elements, this series is by PA Works, and so you can reasonably assume that it will be beautiful to watch, and there's a good chance it will be an original. Right on both counts, and it is another entry in their canon of works that taking place by the seaside. But fine by me, I love the ocean, I don't mind seeing them animated. The title will also clue you in that the story involves two girls meeting. However, the lion's share of the premiere is actually given over to one of those girls in particular. She is an idol who seems to be getting out of the biz, though there is a nice level of... didn't work. That one right there, she's an idol. There's a nice level of ambiguity about everything that goes into her decision to get out of the business, though. And then faced with the prospect of returning home, well, she makes an impulsive choice and decides to fly to Okinawa instead. This is where our other girl resides, and from a few bits we can ascertain that she works for an aquarium that is having some unspecified difficulties. Now, I'm only being vague because of being spoiler conscious. The premiere itself does not, I'm not only being vague because of the spoiler consciousness. This premiere itself, it doesn't try to give us every detail out of the gate. Instead, we get a lot of show-don't-tell scenes to set up the two circumstances without having anyone just sit down and explain them to us. There's a lot of sequences with no dialogue at all, letting the mood and the mindset of the girls fill in the resulting empty space. It's obvious they are both troubled, but as much as anything, we discern this from their body language and memories, as well as the contrast between how they act alone versus how they act around others. There is also potentially a speculative fiction element to the story, yet it's another thing that is not plainly spelled out. It's questionable how much is reality, and how much is a stylistic way of representing theme. I would suggest it may be magical realism based off of just one episode so far, but it actually may turn out to have no true unrealistic elements at all. Either way that turns out, it seems as though it will either echo or prod the girls forward, as each appears at some critical turning point for their direction. The aforementioned aquarium seems as though it will feature a good bit, and it has the air of a place of transition. We are told that tradition suggests that the area was once believed to connect the real world to other worlds, and perhaps is meant to still contain some of this ethereal quality. The explanation of its name, the Gamma Gamma Aquarium, it seems like it actually might be a good way to sum up the intended feel of the series overall. A strange place that is still near home. Next on our list, we have got the case study of Vanitas. Maybe. Yes. There we go. All right. Well, it's got vampires. Lots of classic gothic vampire elements, with some distinct kind of shonen additions, and what appears to be a sprinkling of steampunk. It begins with a vampire folktale about a vampire named Vanitas, that of the series title, who was born under a blue moon, in contrast to most vampires who are born under the crimson moon. This causes him to become an outcast, and he vows revenge on the rest of vampire kind through a tool called the Book of Vanitas that would corrupt their true names. After that stylistically distinct prologue, we join a man named Noe on his way to Paris via airship. he has been sent to look for this book. A short series of events sees him get involved with a strange, blue-eyed man who has stolen onto the airship in search of something himself, and it seems to put them at cross purposes. Now, that's all the narrative that I'll give away. Let's talk about the other stuff. The series clearly has a lot of style. The character designs, set designs, the dream or otherworldly sequences, magical effects, the props, the vehicles. If nothing else, I suspected the art director had an absolute blast with this one. It helps set your expectations of what particular flavor of vampire story we are dealing with. This is not Blood the Last Vampire, and it is not Vampire Knight. This leans much more into urban fantasy, given a little shonen steampunk sprinkling on top, rather than picking up some of the horror or dark fantasy tropes that you might otherwise anticipate. You thus end up with things like shonen fighter-esque power-up sequences, intermixed with period piece settings and drama. Likewise, you can only expect to go just so long with any male character before they do something goofy and go off-model, preventing the mood from ever getting too serious. Perhaps in vampire fiction, this effectively works to corral the story away from ever becoming, too edgy. Now, the premiere doesn't completely finish the setup, although the opening credits manage to fill in some of the blanks, along with a dose of tone whiplash. Instead of finishing said setup, the end of the episode looks far ahead to set out to the overall shape of the series, some of the hurdles to expect, and even a final destination. Where we are left off, I would expect a series that veers between slapstick, high-energy action sequences, and bittersweet drama, all with a quasi-buddy cop setup, and against the backdrop of Victorian-era Paris. And also vampires. Next on our list, you thought you could get through a whole anime season without having a sports show? You were wrong. Remake is a sports anime, water polo in this particular case. Alright, so to try to tie this in with the rest of our story. So for a couple of previous titles, we've had a premise that involved a character having information that the others around them don't suspect. Time rewinding, remembering a previous life, just being straight up summoned into another world with a modern human education. In all of those, the main character is likely to enjoy some advantage due to having unexpected knowledge. Remain, though, it flips that idea. Our main character has been in a coma for half a year due to a car wreck before waking up in the opening scene. Not only did he miss whatever happened in that time period, he cannot remember the 3 years preceding it either. In his case, that means he doesn't remember his entire middle school experience. The people he met, the things he learned in school, and the way the people around him grew. But for him, it's like he's time-traveled 3 years into the future, but for his family at least, it's as though time stopped during the months that he was unconscious. He knows less than everyone else about what he's done, and in a way, less about who he is. While all that could be troubling on its own, it turns out he was part of a Nationals-winning water polo team, with the accident happening immediately afterward. Yet, it appears he must have started playing during the time blanked from his memory, as he knows nothing about it, doesn't recognize his teammates, and also doesn't have any attachment to it. Reading articles and seeing pictures of himself is kind of like learning about a stranger. There's thus a lot of early focus on his family and how they deal with his reawakening, as you have the effort to support him, and also to move past the terrible state they've been in while he languished, something that he didn't actually have to suffer through. He suggests picking water polo back up as a way of making things seem normal for them again, but well, all of the problems with that notion form the second half of the episode, and I think I have given away plenty. We haven't gotten to meet the full cast yet, really, but his family seems really endearing, really realistic out of the gate. Now, this is a sports anime, so I think you can assume certain trajectories, despite the atypical beginning. It does not actually complete the setup you might expect from one, though, due in part to how they wanted to end the episode. Just to stick it to you. It's also an anime original, one of just 3 that we are talking about today. I think the advantage of being anime first, it comes across in the pacing of this premiere especially. It also seems like it will feature some man service, if that's your thing, but frankly it would be weird if it didn't. Overall, I like the setup to this point, and the efforts at realism and how his tragedy is addressed, but I definitely need a second episode to make sure that actually is the overall plan. If it continues, though, it looks very promising. Next on our list, that chose a different method for how it wants to set expectations. Scarlet Nexus tries to do a lot with its premiere, perhaps too much. Now, a lot of the difficulties are best explained by its video game origin, making the premiere something analogous to a tutorial. Hang on. First episode really feels like a tutorial. The mechanics of how speculative elements work, antagonistic forces that are arrayed against our heroes, the setting and its departures from our reality, and meeting the cast of characters with a cursory introduction to their motivations and any existing relationships. It's a lot to try to run through, and so the structure of the premiere is likely to be one that you've seen many times before, functional if uninspired. So, some quick details. Scarlet Nexus features a nation under assault from a bizarre enemy they refer to as the Others, of eldritch abominations which descend from the sky. Arrayed against them are the OSF, the Other Suppression Force. Very on the nose. And their defining attribute is that they fight with various forms of telekinesis. Pyrokinesis, aerokinesis, electrokinesis, and as well as things like clairvoyance and telepathy. Mental powers, basically. They're basically espers. Some with innate talent, and those who have cultivated through training. They are the Scarlet Guardians, and the role comes with some stylish black and crimson outfits and some really kind of cool helmets. But besides that, we follow 2 pairs of new Guardians on their first day. Yuito and Nagi, 2 guys who are friends, and Kasane and Naomi, 2 girls who are adoptive sisters. The girls belong to a prestigious family, while Yuito is the son of the nation's founder. Nagi is, he's there too. We're subjected to explanatory speeches that suit for introducing new members to the service, meeting other veterans that they will work alongside, and a first skirmish with the mysterious Others, so we can see all these psionic abilities in action. They also sprinkle in a few ongoing worries or goals for Yuito and Kasane, which sort of suggests that they'll be the main character. While what the series will need in the very short term is space to let all these introduced characters interact and flesh out a bit more, as this premiere spent a lot more of its time trying to show off the spectacle of the series' action. The bare taste we got at least teases potential, but with such a large cast, it will need focus soon, I think, if they want the audience to stay engaged. Out of the premiere alone, I just don't feel like they pulled that off. There are at least some mysteries teased on top of the usual setup, hence that the world as it is presented and understood is not at all the full story. The game source itself, it's only been out for like 3 weeks too, so the 2 properties were obviously developed simultaneously. I actually find myself more curious about the differences between how they will spin their story than maybe anything else, assuming that their parallel developments each influence the other. Regardless of this, the anime part is going to have to overcome the hindrances of a game world, which is not nearly so dependent on narrative. Spectacle takes you a long way in gaming, only so far in more passive entertainment. That is the hurdle for them to overcome. We'll see. We'll see. So the next thing we're going to talk about, it's happy time, right? Look how happy everybody is. Life lessons with Uramichi Onii-san. Alright, life lessons with Uramichi Onii-san. Uramichi, the title character, is a former elite gymnast who now hosts a kids' TV show where he plays a happy, energetic Onii-san to the kids, leading them in sing-alongs and other little games. But in reality, he is not exactly a happy camper. He's emotionally unstable and unhappy, and this malaise occasionally leaks through his host persona. Quite the contrast, as are his attempts to explain his occasional outburst to the children in terms they might understand. The other adults on the show are not too dissimilar, dropping their act when not on camera. Each seems to be generally disappointed in something about their lives, or has some fundamental shortcoming. This often leads to a bit of friction between them rather than commiseration, heightening the disagreeable air around their daily lives. However, it seems to mostly be our title character, Uramichi, who lets the mask slip around the children. The life lessons from the title seems to refer to the way he is always imparting advice to the kids, but they are really just things he wishes were different about his own life, or ways he is trying to justify his situation. Or, often enough, warnings about the realities of growing up that he perhaps wishes that someone had told him. Although there's humor in some of the contrast, as well as a few comedy bits, the tone of the opening is, well, it's a bit bleak, but punctuated with the upbeat parts of the kids, with their innocent but often confused reactions to the moments that the bitterness leaks out. For the premiere at least, we get no goals, no specific past regrets or turning points. There's no indication of what the future holds, a sense of a change on the horizon. In short, no difference at all for the characters between the beginning and the end of the episode. Since it entails several days of the cycle of get up, be a pretend happy person for the kids, go drinking, go home, repeat, the lack of progress inside the premiere makes the cycle seem inescapable, oppressive. And it may be that that's exactly what they're going for, as the impression overall is a lot more hopeless than comical, despite it having the structure of a comedy. Perhaps giving us no good sense of the future direction is a means to emphasize the quiet desperation of our characters, and if so, I'd say it's quite effective. It does leave me unable to judge where we go from here, though. It could easily become a repetitive routine that overstays its welcome, or it could become a character study striking at the heart of why adults like them seem so unfulfilled. Their dissatisfaction with their lives and work isn't particularly notable for, say, an office job, and so it's the contrast of having them pretend to be cheerful for the unsuspecting children that gives the whole situation its bitter teeth. Likewise, the unsophisticated innocence of the children posing them questions creates a natural setup to spur serious self-examination under the pretense of humor. There is potential to do a lot with character progression and philosophical musings, but as of the premiere at least, it remains only that. Potential. There are truths of life in there, but I don't need them delivered this way. Yes. I will say you cannot take this first premiere and do the same thing for a dozen more episodes. No way. But due to the somewhat circular nature of the opening, I suspect that is not going to be the plan. But again, I have actually not watched the next episode, so... Alright, speaking of hopelessness and despair. Next on our list is the Duke of Death, somewhere on here, and his Maid. Duke of Death, Maid, yeah. So the Duke of Death and his Maid is about... See title. The titular Duke is a young man who has been cursed with a death touch when he was just 5 years old. He has been banished because of this to a remote villa, as his mother is afraid of him being in the same house. He is not, however, completely alone. He has a maid named Alice who serves him, and someone else that we actually don't meet in the premiere. Alice, though, is something of a vexing situation for our Duke, as she seems to enjoy getting a rise out of him. She always gets right in his space, tries to tempt him with her posing or raising the hem of her dress, trying to feed him, and so on. The Duke can't understand why she is so cavalier. And indeed, since he cannot touch another person, there's always the possibility that her flirting is somewhat cruel. A tease that will only ever be a tease. She is not forthcoming about what she feels or why she acts, other than confessing to the enjoyment she gets out of his reactions. She's the daughter of the family's head maid, and they've known each other a long time, but she has only shown back up in his life in the past 2 years. People live in fear of him, of course, and it has taken its toll, which means that he is prone to some despair. Yet, he hasn't become someone who disabuses others or is otherwise misanthropic. He's pitiable and has turned inward, and yet despite how desperately he wants human companionship, he's always worried about Alice and tries to get her not to be so risky with all of her interactions. That is to say, that both his situation and his response to it are likely to invoke audience sympathies, and the horror show of what his life must be like makes Alice seem all the more mysterious in the ways that she chooses to behave. While this episode was primarily about setting up the titular pair, there is a bit of hints around his family and friends and his past that suggest the cast size will probably open up in the near future. Aside from what I've said, I think the style will stand out a bit. The backgrounds are sufficiently sumptuous, as befits the aristocratic circumstances, yet they're also mostly overlaid with a texture that gives them a bit of a painterly impression. In contrast, character models are usually computer-generated, separating quite a bit from the very analog-seeming environment. While you may have moments of stiffness in characters, it's common with CG, there's a lot of work on the lighting, at least, to make the characters look like they fit into those 2D spaces they inhabit. It's kind of risky to make richly detailed backgrounds to go with 3D CG. And so in that respect, it feels like progress. However, I'm not sure why they went with this choice. Nothing about the art direction strikes me as something that benefits from CG compared to similar designs in traditional animation. And honestly, that is more of a curiosity to me than the actual execution. Anyway, this episode is purely setup. It gives us enough space to meet the main two, and kind of an abstract goal for the series overall. I'm curious where it goes from here, as, at least from the premiere, it doesn't seem like there's a full season's worth of story. But that could rapidly change once we expand beyond the main duo. So, to put that one right beside more CG, next up on our list is Nighthead some year. Nighthead 2041. Well, I've given away the game. Basically, Nighthead 2041, it's based on a television series from the early 90s, and actually has an anime installment already. However, this seems like it is fine as a standalone tale. That's why I have included it in today's roundup. And partially because I found it kind of unexpectedly hype. Now, the likely first thing you're going to notice, it's almost entirely CG. Which is why, of course, I'm talking about it immediately after Duke of Death. Although Nighthead does make the blunder of mixing 2D and 3D characters in the same scene, most of the CG work is pretty good. Importantly, in contrast to Duke of Death, leaning hard into computer-generated imagery makes a lot of sense for the story world and all of its futuristic elements. In short, we are following 2 pairs of brothers. One pair is part of some group which enforces the government's crackdown on belief in anything supernatural. And the other pair seems to have been newly let out of a lab where they have lived a good part of their life, and they are now been dumped into, well, a strange new world. They assume it means that the world has reached a place where people like themselves may be accepted, but, well, let's just say a lot has happened while they weren't watching the news. In fact, our action set piece for this premiere is a SWAT-style raid against a bunch of people accused of believing in a psychic? I mean, I actually understand that reaction, but it seems a bit much. If nothing else, it helps us understand the way the world has changed in this imagined future. The enemy is not without, but within. We seem to be dropped into the story actually right as new developments will perhaps challenge that new normal. Even though they make the initial setup pretty obvious overall, it hits us with a few mysterious elements to keep us off balance. Regretfully, the premiere only manages to characterize a couple of characters to any real degree, as most of the runtime is setting up the world and its current status quo. However, I can understand wanting to lead with a lot of spectacle, considering the skepticism that awaits any anime that has heavy CG. You can see it in chat, I'm sure. I felt like it delivered on that front, at least. If that was the goal, I feel like they probably achieved it. And the technoscape of its world building will probably hold a lot of appeal all by itself. I don't know whether I like it, hate it, am intrigued by it, put off of it. It could be all those things at once. I feel like that was the... they needed to make a splash. There's a lot of pushback against CG. While not perfect, this is so different than what we were looking at, even 5 years ago from most offerings. So, and yeah, the first bit, it definitely wants to get your attention, wants to push past your skepticism, and ask you to keep watching. All right, we've come to the last thing on the list. What is that? Hour and a half? That's pretty good. For 18, let us talk about Kageki Shoujo. All right. So, this is the Takarazuka review in all but name. As some of you may remember, I made a whole video about the review before a little series on review Starlight, so that we'd all be on the same page with the background that, kind of helps your understanding of what's going on. It's not often that you get extra innings out of your past work, but it seems that same 11-minute video would also be very helpful to set you up to watch Kageki Shoujo. So, and I actually, not just as useful, more useful, as this is a way more grounded show without speculative fiction elements. It is also very shoujo, as some of the character designs will make rather plain. The story begins with part of the process for admittance to the school that trains girls to take part in the review. And it is in fact their historic 100th class, which garners extra attention and perhaps some liberties with the usual screening process. We mostly follow 2 girls whose personalities are like oil and water. Ai is a former idol, but undisclosed problems with male fans led her to graduate early. Joining the all-girls review is something she wants as a bit of a safe haven, and she is certainly qualified. The other girl, Sarasa, is, well, she's certainly enthusiastic, and very tall, and very athletic, and not at all sophisticated. Of course, she latches on to Ai, whose dreams of a peaceful 2 years seem to be over before they've begun. Outside of this pair, we do get a little sampling of the personalities in the rest of the class. The review is extremely competitive, so while these girls are classmates, they are perhaps rivals first. It is a foregone conclusion that sparks are going to fly in the future. This premiere also does something I think wise for this particular type of show, which is that it does not go for spectacle, or some complex routine, or anything just to show off out of the gate. Other than a few scenes to characterize the review itself, almost all of the runtime is dedicated to characterization. That is what will carry the show, so this decision is very encouraging to me about the overall strength. There's lots of good things to say about this show, so in conclusion, yes. Just yes. And not just because I liked to review Starlight back in the day. This is a totally different kind of show, while still having the same topic, or the same subject, the seed for its story. Yes. No giraffe, but a conspicuously tall main character. Yeah, a good way to describe it. Animation is careful and delightful rather than being, spectacle, being sakuga. And that is the 18 shows I chose to talk about. I gotta tell you something. Whew. This new world, it's not any cooler than the one I left.